Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Today we dive into the dark depths of Warhammer history to unravel the mystery behind the lost 2nd and 11th Primarch legions. You see, the Warhammer universe is filled with secrets, lies, and forgotten histories. But among all the things the Imperium has buried, nothing is as chillingly erased as the 11th and 11th legions. These aren't just missing records. They aren't just lost to time. Because the deeper you dig into this mystery, the more you realize that the lost Primarchs weren't just casualties of history. They were erased for a reason. And that reason? It could change everything we think we know about the Emperor, the Great Crusade, and even the very foundation of the Imperium itself. Now let's start with what we do know. The official Imperial stance on the lost legions is simple. They never existed. At least, that's what the records say. The 2nd and Exile legions, along with their Primarchs, were subjected to something called an Edict of Obliteration, a punishment so severe that it basically erases any trace of someone from history. The High Gothic term for this is damnatio memoria, literally the condemnation of memory. And in an empire where history is both sacred and a weapon, this is the ultimate punishment. To be forgotten is to never have existed. This is the kind of punishment usually reserved for the absolute worst of the worst. Traitors, heretics, those who have done something so unthinkable that even mentioning their name is considered an act of treason. And here's where things get even stranger. Even during the Horus Heresy, when some of the Emperor's most trusted sons turned against him in the greatest betrayal the galaxy has ever seen, none of them were erased from history. Their names remained. Their stories were told. Horus, the greatest traitor of them all, still has statues and paintings in some dark corners of the Imperium. His name is still spoken, even if it's only in hatred. So whatever the lost Primarchs did, it had to be worse than the Horus Heresy. Let that sink in for a moment. Despite the Imperium's best efforts, you can't completely erase something that was once real. If you look hard enough, if you pay attention to the right whispers, you start to see the cracks. And those cracks lead to some very interesting clues. For all the Imperium's efforts to erase the 2nd and 11th legions from history, traces of them still exist, hidden in scattered lines of dialogue, vague references, and the occasional slip of information. If you know where to look, if you read between the lines, you start to see the shape of something the Imperium desperately wants to forget. One of the clearest references to the lost Primarchs comes from the Lightning Tower, a short story in which Rogal Dorn walks the halls of the Imperial Palace. As he moves through the massive structure, he comes across a row of plinths, each meant to hold a statue of a Primarch, but 2 of them stand empty. Dorn, ever the serious and introspective warrior, doesn't just dismiss their absence. Instead, he wonders if their fates were a warning that no one paid attention to. This small moment speaks volumes. The Imperium has never shied away from remembering its enemies. Even the traitor Primarchs, those who turned against the Emperor and nearly destroyed the Imperium, are remembered, if only as figures of hatred. The fact that the lost Primarchs didn't even get statues suggests that their erasure was absolute. They weren't just disowned or denounced. They were unmade. Then there's Magnus the Red. In 1000 Suns, he makes a seemingly offhand comment to Mortarion during the triumph of Ulanor. He notes that 9 Primarchs had gathered for the celebration and starts to mention the last time so many of them had been in one place. Mortarion's response is immediate and severe. He cuts Magnus off and reminds him that the Emperor forbade them from speaking of it. This is more than just an unspoken taboo, it's a command. The Emperor didn't just want the 2nd and 11th legions erased from history. He wanted them erased from memory, from thought, from conversation. Whatever happened to them, he wanted it buried forever. Another eerie clue comes from the First Heretic, where Lorgar, the Primarch who would later lead the first open rebellion against the Emperor, expresses his own fear of suffering the same fate. After being humiliated by the Emperor for his religious beliefs, Lorgar confides in Magnus that he fears what might happen next. He says that he and the word-bearers might be cast alongside the brothers we no longer speak of. Think about that. Lorgar, the first and greatest traitor, feared that his punishment might be the same as whatever happened to the lost Primarchs. And yet, we know that Lorgar wasn't erased. His name remains in the Imperial records. His actions are still studied by historians, if only to denounce them. That means that whatever happened to the lost Primarchs must have been even worse than full-scale rebellion. Corvus Corax, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, also provides a chilling glimpse into the mystery in Deliverance Lost. When he meets the Emperor for the first time, he expresses excitement at the idea of having brothers. The Emperor tells him that 17 of his siblings have already been found. Corax, confused, points out that he was number 19, so how could there only be 17 others? The Emperor's response is grim. He simply says that it's a conversation for another day, and that day never comes. The fact that the Emperor personally avoids the topic suggests that the lost Primarch's fates were not just classified but deeply painful, even to him. And then there's Fear to Tread, a novel about Sanguinius and the Blood Angels. In one key moment, Horus asks Sanguinius why he has never told the Emperor about the Red Thirst, the genetic flaw that drives the Blood Angels into a near-vampiric rage. Sanguinius reacts violently, snapping that he will not be responsible for placing a third empty plinth in the Hall of the Hegemon. A third empty plinth. That line is easy to overlook, but it raises an unsettling question. We know that 2 Primarchs were erased, but why would Sanguinius say third? It suggests that he believed that if the Emperor discovered the Red Thirst, the Blood Angels would suffer the same fate as the Lost Legions. That implies that the Lost Primarchs were purged not for treason, but for flaws. Beyond these scattered references, there are rumors within the Legiones Astartes themselves. Space Marines are known for their loyalty, but even they whisper about the Lost Legions. Some say they were absorbed into the Ultramarines, explaining why Guilliman's legions swelled in numbers more than any other. Others say they were wiped out completely, not just in records, but in reality. There are even hints in Prospero Burns that the Space Wolves were used to execute them. Lyman Russ, known as the Emperor's Executioner, remarks at one point that he has been tasked with bringing a fellow legion to heel before. Given that the Space Wolves were later sent to destroy the Thousand Suns, this suggests a disturbing pattern. Perhaps the Lost Legions were simply the first ones to face the Emperor's wrath. One of the most haunting hints comes from Vulcan Lives. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, openly admits to his equerry that he has no desire to see another legion purged. He states that bearing the grief for 2 lost brothers is already too much to carry. His words make it clear. The Lost Primarchs were sanctioned. They were destroyed. And Vulcan, one of the most compassionate and moral of the Primarchs, carries that grief with him. That means the erasure of the Lost Primarchs wasn't just a clerical decision. It was a personal, painful event, one that still weighed on those who had survived it. Even in more obscure sources, the whispers continue. In the Unremembered Empire, when Lionel Johnson arrives at Macragge, Guilliman shows him a chamber where seats are set aside for all the Primarchs. 2 of the banners are blank, made from plain, bleached cloth. Guilliman states that the places of the Lost Primarchs must still be honored, even if they are never to return. The Imperium is built on ceremony, on tradition, on remembering. And yet, even in a place meant to honor the sons of the Emperor, all that remains of the Lost Primarchs are empty chairs and nameless banners. This pattern repeats over and over again. The 2 and 11 legions are absent from every war record, every historical document. The Imperium remembers everything, every battle, every hero, every victory and failure. But for the Lost Legions, nothing remains, not even their symbols. When Malcador the Sigillite walks past the old laboratory where the Primarchs were created, 2 Legion icons have been scratched out, not simply removed, but actively destroyed. That is what makes this mystery so unique. The Imperium does not destroy its past lightly. Even the darkest moments of its history are preserved. The Horus Heresy itself, the single greatest disaster the Imperium has ever faced, is still studied in exhaustive detail. So why were the Lost Primarchs erased? Why were their names forbidden? Why were they not simply killed, but wiped from reality itself? The clues paint a picture of something far worse than mere treason. Something so unacceptable that even remembering it is considered a crime. Whatever the truth is, it is a truth the Imperium cannot afford to let survive. There are several prevailing theories as to why the Lost Primarchs and their legions were purged. Some of these are based on subtle lore hints, others on gaps in the narrative, and others still on logical deductions about the Emperor's methods and long-term strategy. Theory 1. Genetic catastrophe. The Primarchs who should never have been the means. The Emperor was a master of genetic engineering, but even he was not infallible. We already know that many of the Primarchs suffered from genetic flaws, some minor, others catastrophic. The Blood Angels struggle with the red thirst, an uncontrollable craving for blood that can drive them to madness. The Space Wolves are afflicted by the Canis Helix, a genetic mutation that makes them more beast than man. The Thousand Sons were riddled with rampant psychic instability, mutating and degrading over time. What if the Lost Primarchs suffered from something even worse? The Horus Heresy novels mention that some of the Primarchs had additional genetic modifications, while others had sequences deliberately removed. This suggests that the Emperor may have adjusted their genetic templates individually, tweaking and correcting errors as needed. Perhaps with the Lost Primarchs, something went irreparably wrong, something that could not be fixed or controlled. This theory is supported by Fear to Tread, in which Sanguinius, when confronted about his legion's genetic flaw, angrily declares that he will not allow a third empty plinth to stand in the hall of the hegemon. The implication is that the Blood Angels were at risk of suffering the same fate as the Lost Legions, suggesting that the erasure of the 2 and Lethen legions may have been due to severe genetic corruption. But what could that corruption have been? One possibility is that their gene seed caused extreme instability, not just in their Astartes, but in the Primarchs themselves. If one of the Lost Primarchs physically mutated beyond recognition, if his body warped into something unholy, it's possible that the Emperor had no choice but to destroy him and his entire legion to prevent the corruption from spreading. Another chilling possibility is that the genetic corruption affected their minds rather than their bodies. The Primarchs were designed to be godlike beings, but they were not immune to psychological degradation. What if one or both of the Lost Primarchs descended into madness, not from chaos, but from something even the Emperor could not explain? The most disturbing version of this theory suggests that one of them may have become something unnatural, not a chaos demon, but something else entirely. Something new. Something the Emperor could not control, and therefore had to erase before it reshaped history itself. Theory 2. The First Rebellion, a war before the Horus Heresy. Most people assume that Horus was the first Primarch to rebel against the Emperor, but what if that isn't true? What if there was another rebellion before the Horus Heresy, one so terrible that the Emperor had to make sure it was never spoken of again? There is some evidence to support this idea. In Prospero Burns, Lemon Russ makes a cryptic comment implying that his Space Wolves had already been used as executioners before. Given that the Space Wolves were later unleashed against Magnus and the Thousand Sons, this raises an obvious question. Who was their first target? It makes sense that if one or both of the Lost Primarchs turned against the Emperor, the punishment would have been swift and absolute. Unlike Horus, who was able to build an empire-spanning conspiracy before the Emperor acted, an early rebellion would have been crushed instantly. The Space Wolves, or perhaps another legion, would have been sent to exterminate them before they could spread their ideology or rally allies. This would also explain why their fate was different from the traitor Primarchs of the Horus Heresy. Horus and his followers were allowed to wage a full-scale war, and their betrayal became one of the most well-documented events in history. But if the Lost Primarchs rebelled before the Great Crusade was finished, before the Imperium was strong enough to withstand such a crisis, the Emperor may have realized that their treason could not be allowed to be remembered. It would have been a failure too dangerous to acknowledge. Theory 3. A deal with the enemy. Did they turn to chaos first? One of the most common assumptions is that the Lost Primarchs may have been the first to fall to chaos. This would explain why they were erased. After all, the Horus Heresy itself nearly destroyed the Imperium. If one or both of the Lost Primarchs defected before Horus, it would have been a catastrophic revelation. But there's a problem with this theory. If the Lost Primarchs were simply early traitors, why erase them completely? The Imperium had no issue denouncing Horus, Lorgar, and the rest of the traitors. Their names were preserved in infamy, so that no one would ever forget their treachery. The fact that the lost Primarchs were not only destroyed, but erased from memory suggests that their fate was worse than treason. There is, however, a more unsettling possibility. What if the lost Primarchs did not merely fall to chaos? What if they discovered something about chaos itself that even the Emperor wanted to keep buried? The Emperor, despite his claims of rationality and science, clearly had knowledge of chaos. He created the Primarchs to be resistant to it. He designed the Webway project to replace warp travel, eliminating humanity's reliance on the Immaterium. What if one or both of the lost Primarchs stumbled upon the truth of chaos before they were meant to? Perhaps they learned something that should not be known, something that made them dangerous not just to the Imperium, but to the Emperor himself. If they uncovered a secret about chaos that undermined the Emperor's authority, perhaps even something about the Emperor's own origins, then their erasure would have been an act of desperation. A way to ensure that no one else ever learned what they had learned. Theory 4. The Emperor's own mistake. Were they a failed experiment? A final theory suggests that the lost Primarchs were never meant to be discovered at all. We know that the Primarchs were scattered through the warp before the Emperor could raise them himself. We know that they landed on strange and distant worlds, shaping them into warlords and kings. But what if that wasn't an accident? What if the lost Primarchs were sent somewhere deliberately, not by the Chaos Gods, but by the Emperor himself? Perhaps the Emperor realized that two of his creations were flawed before they had even been found. Maybe they had already exhibited traits that made them too dangerous to integrate into the Imperium. Rather than let them be discovered, perhaps the Emperor arranged for them to be hidden, kept away from the Imperium entirely. And maybe, just maybe, something found them anyway. If the lost Primarchs encountered something in the warp, something that should never have been awakened, then their fate would have been sealed. Their erasure would not have been a punishment. It would have been containment. And the greatest question of all, what if they are still out there? Waiting. One of the most chilling possibilities is that one of the lost Primarchs is still on Terra, trapped deep beneath the Imperial Palace. This isn't as far-fetched as it might seem. The Emperor is known to have kept powerful individuals imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the throne, some for their crimes, some because they were too dangerous to be left free. In the Sigillite, Malcador leads an agent through the hidden depths of the Imperial Palace, where ancient relics and forbidden secrets are locked away. Among them, the agent notices two symbols that have been scratched out, erased from Imperial record. The implication is clear. These were the symbols of the lost legions. But what if it wasn't just their icons that were erased? What if one of the lost Primarchs is still down there, imprisoned for reasons no one dares to speak of? This theory would explain why their names were so completely erased. The Imperium has no problem remembering the dead. But a Primarch who is still alive, one who might still pose a threat, would need to be forgotten entirely. What would such a being be like after 10,000 years of isolation? Would he still be loyal to the Emperor? Or would centuries of imprisonment have turned him into something else entirely? A hidden weapon waiting to be unleashed? Or a vengeful god waiting for the day he can strike back at the Imperium that buried him? And most importantly, does the Emperor himself still acknowledge his existence? Or has even he forgotten? The Imperium is vast, but it is not infinite. The known galaxy is only a fraction of the universe, and the Emperor was nothing if not a man of contingencies. What if one of the lost Primarchs was not erased, but sent away, not as a punishment, but as a mission? Consider this. The Emperor, despite all his power, was fighting a losing battle against the Chaos Gods. He knew the war against chaos was not just a war for the galaxy, but a war for the very survival of humanity. And the best way to ensure survival? A backup plan. What if one of the lost Primarchs was tasked with leading an expedition beyond the Milky Way? A fleet sent to another galaxy, a last-ditch effort to seed human civilization somewhere chaos could never reach? This would explain why records of the two legion were deliberately erased, not as punishment, but as protection. If the Chaos Gods ever discovered that an entire legion had been sent beyond their reach, they would have done everything in their power to stop it. By erasing all records, the Emperor ensured that no one could betray the plan, not even his own sons. If this theory is true, then somewhere, far beyond the reach of the Imperium, there could be a human empire ruled by a lost Primarch. One untouched by chaos, one that has developed in isolation for 10,000 years. A hidden civilization waiting for the right moment to return. But would they return as saviors or as conquerors? One of the strangest and most enigmatic Space Marine chapters in the 41st millennium is the Carcharodons, also known as the Space Sharks. Unlike most chapters, their origins are completely unknown. They appear seemingly out of nowhere, striking with brutal efficiency before vanishing into the void. And here's the thing, they are too big to be just a chapter. Their numbers, their tactics, and their genetic purity suggest something far stranger. There's a theory that the Carcharodons are not just another chapter, but the descendants of the Lost Legion, or possibly even the remnants of the Lost Legion itself. This would explain several things. First, their fighting style. The Carcharodons fight with an almost feral brutality, tearing through enemies with a level of violence that is unusual even for Space Marines. This could suggest that their Primarch's genetic lineage was one of unrestrained savagery, a Primarch so unstable that the Emperor was forced to erase his very existence. Second, their self-imposed exile. The Carcharodons do not live within Imperial space. They operate on the galactic rim, at the very edges of known space, keeping themselves isolated. This could be a direct order from their Primarch, a way to remain hidden, forgotten, until the right moment. And then there's their leader, Chapter Master Tyberos the Red Wake. Tyberos is massive, even by Astartes standards, and is known for his extreme combat abilities. Some have theorized that he could be more than just a Space Marine, that he could be the last remnant of a Primarch's bloodline. If the Carcharodons truly are the remains of one of the Lost Legions, then their return to Imperial space could mean one of two things. Either they have been watching and waiting, preparing to rejoin the Imperium at its darkest hour, or they have been biding their time, growing stronger in the shadows, preparing for a reckoning the Imperium is not ready for. There is one last, terrifying possibility. What if one of the lost Primarchs did not die, did not flee, and was not imprisoned? What if he was claimed by the warp itself? We know that when the Primarchs were scattered, it was chaos that pulled them into the warp and threw them across the galaxy. We also know that some, like Magnus, had a deep connection to the Immaterium. But what if one of the lost Primarchs never truly left the warp? What if he exists between realms, a being of flesh and nightmare, neither alive nor dead? This would explain why his existence was erased so thoroughly. If he became something that defied the laws of reality itself, if he turned into something that could not be contained by the material world, the Emperor may have had no choice but to delete him from history. Not to punish him, but to protect reality itself. A Primarch who became a warp entity would be something unlike any of the demon Primarchs we know. He would not serve chaos. He would be something beyond chaos, something even the dark gods might fear. And if he still exists in some form, he might one day return. Not as a servant of the Imperium, not as a servant of chaos, but as something else entirely. The Imperium is built on control. It thrives on order, hierarchy, and the careful manipulation of history. The return of a lost Primarch, one that the Emperor himself deemed too dangerous to exist, would be nothing short of a catastrophe. Every faction within the Imperium, from the High Lords of Terra to the Inquisition, would have to decide whether to embrace him, suppress him, or eliminate him before his presence shattered the fragile balance of power. The first and most immediate question is, how would he return? Would he emerge from some hidden sanctuary, revealing that he and his legion had survived in exile for 10,000 years? Would he step out of the warp, a changed being shaped by the forces of the Immaterium? Or would he be uncovered by accident, found imprisoned deep beneath Terra, Mars, or some forgotten ruin, where the Emperor had locked him away in the hopes that no one would ever find him? If he were discovered within the Imperium itself, the reaction would depend heavily on who found him first. If Guilliman were the one to stand before his long-lost brother, he would likely hesitate before taking action. As pragmatic as he is, Guilliman is still a son of the Emperor. He knows the power of the Primarchs, both as symbols and as leaders. If the lost Primarch presented himself as a potential ally, one who could bolster the Imperium's failing strength, Guilliman might be willing to hear him out. But Guilliman is also a master strategist, and he knows that history is filled with cautionary tales of those who return from exile. He would suspect a trap, a deception, or some hidden flaw that the Emperor had seen but that he could not. The Inquisition, on the other hand, would not hesitate. They have spent thousands of years maintaining the Emperor's unspoken decree that the lost Primarchs were never to be spoken of again. If one of them reappeared, the Inquisition would act immediately. Before the Primarch could gain support, before his name could spread, the Inquisition would seek to silence him, through assassination, subterfuge, or outright warfare. To them, the return of a lost Primarch would be the return of an unpredictable variable, a force they cannot control. And the Imperium does not tolerate what it cannot control. And then there is the ecclesiarchy. To them, the Primarchs are not simply warlords. They are the literal sons of the Emperor. Divine beings whose actions are part of a grand, sacred plan. The return of a lost Primarch would be seen as either a miracle or a heresy of the highest order. If he did not immediately submit to their authority, if he so much as questioned the state of the Imperium, they would turn their followers against him. They have crushed powerful figures before, entire Space Marine chapters, rogue governors, even Lord Commanders of the Imperium. If the lost Primarch did not conform to the Imperial creed, they would declare him a false prophet and wage holy war against him. The reaction of the Adeptus Astartes would be far more divided. To many Space Marines, the return of a Primarch, any Primarch, would be seen as a sign of hope. The Imperium has long been in decline, fighting endless wars with fewer and fewer resources. If a lost Primarch returned with a legion at his back, it could inspire the Astartes to rally behind him. But that loyalty would not be absolute. Some chapters, particularly those who revere Guilliman, might see the lost Primarch as a danger, a destabilizing force that threatens to undo the fragile unity of the Imperium. Others, like the Black Templars, would be wary of any being who claims authority without first proving their faith in the Emperor. And what of the Custodians? The Emperor's personal guard, the only warriors who truly understood his will? They might know the truth behind the lost Primarchs. They might have been there when they were erased. If that is the case, they would have only one duty, to ensure that history is not rewritten. They would act, not as protectors, but as executioners. Even if the Primarch meant no harm, even if he sought only to serve, the Custodes might decide that the risk of his return was too great. They would move in silence, cutting him down before his presence could ignite something the Imperium was not prepared to face. But even if the Imperium rejected him, even if the Inquisition and the High Lords of Terra branded him a traitor, he would not be without allies. The galaxy is vast, and the Imperium's enemies are many. The forces of chaos would see him as an opportunity, a chance to corrupt another of the Emperor's sons. The Dark Gods do not care about loyalty, they care about power, and a forgotten Primarch, filled with resentment for his exile, could be an ideal target for their influence. Would the lost Primarch resist them, holding to his own beliefs despite the Imperium's betrayal? Or would he listen to their whispers, considering their offers in ways he never would have before? The Xenos empires would also take notice. The Eldar, with their foresight and long memory, might know the truth of the lost Primarchs better than the Imperium itself. If one of them returned, the Eldar would move swiftly, either to manipulate him into their own designs or to ensure that his presence did not disrupt the delicate balance of fate. The Necrons, cold and calculating, might see him as an anomaly, a relic of a failed experiment they once observed from afar. The Tau, still expanding and eager for powerful allies, might attempt to recruit him, offering him a vision of an empire built on unity rather than oppression. And then there is the worst-case scenario, the idea that the lost Primarch did not return alone. What if he found something during his exile? What if he became something else? 10,000 years is a long time, and no being, not even a Primarch, would emerge from such an absence unchanged. If he had been in the warp, he might have developed abilities that defied explanation. If he had been imprisoned, he might have learned secrets that even the Emperor feared. If he had spent those millennia beyond the known galaxy, he might have built something new, a force that sees the Imperium not as a home to return to, but as a failed experiment that must be replaced. Would he come as a liberator, seeking to reform the Imperium into what it was always meant to be? Or would he come as a conqueror, returning to reclaim the throne his father left empty? Would he embrace Guilliman as a brother? Or would he see him as a false heir, unworthy of leading humanity? Would he see the ecclesiarchy as a blasphemous perversion of his father's will and seek to burn it to the ground? There is also the possibility that his very existence would shake the Imperium apart. If a lost Primarch knows the truth about the Emperor, about the webway, about the nature of chaos, he might reveal secrets that could shatter the Imperium's foundations. If he speaks openly of what happened to him, if he proves that history has been manipulated, that the Imperium's leaders have hidden truths from their own people, then faith itself could collapse. Even the most loyal citizens of the Imperium might begin to question the lies they have been told. If one of them returns, it is not just a matter of war. It is a matter of what comes next. Because if they return, the Imperium will have to answer for what was done to them. And they may not like the answer. If a lost Primarch were to return, the moment he set foot in Imperial space would mark the beginning of a reckoning, not just for the High Lords of Terra, not just for Guilliman and the Space Marines, but for the Imperium itself. The very foundation of the Emperor's grand design would be called into question, because no matter how he reappeared, whether from exile, imprisonment, or some impossible survival, the first thing he would demand is answers. For 10,000 years, the Imperium has operated under a carefully maintained illusion. It is an empire of rigid laws, unquestioned faith, and selective memory. The High Lords of Terra, the Inquisition, and even the Adeptus Astartes have spent centuries enforcing a version of history where the lost Primarchs never existed. That illusion works only because no one is alive to contradict it. But a returned Primarch? He would be the contradiction. He would demand to know why he was erased. He would demand to know who carried out his sentence. He would demand to know what happened to his legion. And if those answers were not given willingly, he would take them by force. The Inquisition would move first. No organization in the Imperium is more paranoid, more willing to act preemptively to prevent perceived threats. To them, a lost Primarch is not a hero returning home. He is an anomaly, a break in the order they have spent millennia upholding. They would not care whether he was loyal or treasonous. His very existence would be the problem. If the Inquisition could, they would try to eliminate him before word of his return spread. A swift execution, a quiet purge, something to ensure that the Imperium never knew what had happened. They would deploy assassins, perhaps even the Officio Assassinorum's most elite operatives, Calidus shapeshifters, Vindicare snipers, or, in the most extreme scenario, a Tulexis assassin, the kind reserved for beings whose very presence threatens the fabric of reality. But a Primarch is no ordinary target. He would see them coming, he would expect them, and he would not fall so easily. If the Inquisition failed, if the truth did spread, then everything would change. Guilliman would be forced to act. He is the only Primarch left openly ruling the Imperium, and he is still struggling to hold it together. The return of another of his kind would be a moment of crisis, because Guilliman knows the weight of history better than anyone. He has spent decades trying to undo the mistakes of the Imperium's past, but the Imperium resists change. A second Primarch, one with his own vision, would only add chaos to an already fragile system. Would Guilliman see his lost brother as an ally or as a threat? And more importantly, what would the lost Primarch think of Guilliman? The Imperium that exists today is not the Imperium of the Great Crusade. It is not the dream the Emperor once had. It is a nightmare of bureaucracy, stagnation, and blind worship. Guilliman has had to accept this reality, even as he fights to change it. But a lost Primarch, one who had been frozen in time, unaware of the slow decay of the Imperium, he might refuse to accept it at all. He might look upon the ecclesiarchy, the vast bloated church that worships the Emperor as a god, and see nothing but heresy. He might look upon the High Lords of Terra, corrupt, self-serving aristocrats, and see nothing but betrayal. He might look upon Guilliman himself, his own brother, struggling to maintain this broken empire, and wonder why he has not already torn it down. Would he try to reform the Imperium? Would he attempt to rebuild it in the image of the Emperor's original vision? Would he demand that Guilliman join him in a second Great Crusade? Not against Xenos, not against chaos, but against the Imperium's own corruption? Or would he see Guilliman as just another tyrant, another ruler clinging to power at the cost of what the Imperium was supposed to be? And what if the Lost Primarch had followers? Because that is the true danger. A Primarch alone is powerful, but a Primarch with an army? That is something the Imperium could not ignore. If he returned with his legion, if the erased Space Marines of the two Ordzevine legions had somehow survived in exile, then the Imperium would have no choice but to reckon with its own past. The Legiones Astartes have always been divided, but never like this. A legion of warriors, loyal to a Primarch who was erased, would see every other chapter as an enemy. They would not submit. They would not kneel before Guilliman or the High Lords or the Ecclesiarchy. And what if he called upon other Space Marines to join him? What if he spoke the truth? That the Imperium is broken, that the Emperor never intended for it to become a theocratic prison, that they have been fighting for a lie? There are many chapters that might listen. The Black Templars, so zealous in their faith, might reject him outright, or they might see him as a prophet. The Space Wolves, already distrusted by the Imperium, might rally to his cause, remembering how Russ himself was always an outsider. The Blood Angels, desperate for a cure to their affliction, might see him as salvation. Even Guilliman's own Ultramarines might be divided, questioning whether they should follow their Primarch or one who claims to uphold the Emperor's true will. And what of the Custodes? The Emperor's personal guard, who have remained silent on the matter of the lost Primarchs for 10,000 years? What do they know? Because if one of them returned, the Custodes would act. Not out of loyalty to Guilliman, not out of loyalty to the Imperium, but out of loyalty to the Emperor himself. And if the Emperor ordered their erasure, if the Custodes were the ones who carried out that order, then their duty would be clear. They would finish what they started. A returned lost Primarch would not just be fighting against Guilliman or the High Lords or the Inquisition, he would be fighting against the very forces that erased him from history in the first place. And that raises the most terrifying question of all. What if he remembers? What if he knows why he was erased? What if he knows the Emperor's greatest secret, a truth so dangerous that even the master of mankind himself had to silence his own son? What if that is why the Imperium fears his return? Because he is not just a lost son, he is a witness. A witness to something so terrible that it could burn the Imperium to the ground. And after 10,000 years in the shadows, would he be content to stay silent? Or would he finally speak the truth? If the lost Primarchs were to return, it wouldn't just be a military or political crisis, it would be a spiritual one. The Imperium is a civilization built on lies. Not just any lies, but the kind that have been repeated for so long, enforced so ruthlessly that they've become the foundation of everything. And at the heart of those lies is the idea of the Emperor, the infallible God, the divine ruler who intended for humanity to worship him as they do now, the great master whose vision was flawless and whose Imperium is exactly as he designed it to be. The return of a lost Primarch threatens that myth in ways that even Guilliman never could. Guilliman came back reluctantly, fully aware of how much the Imperium had decayed. He has struggled against it, yes, but ultimately he has had to play along, knowing that change must be slow if it is to avoid tearing the Imperium apart completely. But a lost Primarch? One who was never part of the heresy, who never saw the Imperium become what it is today, who still remembers the Great Crusade as it was meant to be. He would look at what his father's empire has become and demand to know what went wrong. And therein lies the true danger. He wouldn't just be a military leader or a political agitator. He would be a heretic, not in the sense of chaos, but in the far worse sense of someone who questions the fundamental order of the Imperium itself. The Ecclesiarchy, in particular, would see him as an existential threat. The entire Imperial faith is built on the worship of the Emperor as a god, and here comes a being who was created by the Emperor himself, who knew him personally, who can state with absolute certainty that the emperor never wanted to be worshipped. That alone would be enough for the ecclesiarchy to label him a heretic. And unlike Guilliman, who has learned to bite his tongue when it comes to such matters, a lost Primarch would have no patience for such nonsense. He would say it outright. He would shout it from the walls of the Imperial palace if he had to. And the moment he did, the Imperium would tear itself apart. Because here's the thing. Millions, if not billions, would believe him. This isn't some rogue scholar whispering about old texts. This isn't some minor rebellion on a backwater world. This is a Primarch, a godlike being, standing before the Imperium and declaring that its most sacred institution is a lie. There would be planets, entire systems that would revolt overnight, Space Marine chapters that would begin questioning their oaths, Imperial Guard regiments that would refuse to fight. For every person who rejected him as a liar, there would be 10 more who saw him as the voice of truth. And that is the one thing the Imperium cannot allow. Because once the cracks start to form in the faith of the Imperium, they do not stop. It is faith that keeps the Imperium together, not logic, not governance, not even the Adeptus Astartes. The people of the Imperium endure suffering, brutality, and oppression because they believe they are part of something greater. If they lose that belief, then the Imperium doesn't collapse in battle, it rots from within. The reaction would be swift and brutal. The ecclesiarchy would demand his immediate execution. The Inquisition would send kill teams, fleets, entire armies if necessary, to silence him before his words could spread. Guilliman would be put in an impossible position, forced to either stand by his brother and risk civil war, or side with the Imperium that has already rejected so much of what the Emperor originally intended. And if the lost Primarch didn't die quietly, if he fought back, if he gathered followers, if he declared his own war against the corruption of the Imperium, then everything would spiral out of control. There is historical precedent for this. Every time a major figure in the Imperium has tried to challenge the ecclesiarchy, it has ended in war. The Age of Apostasy saw the rise of Goge of Van Dyer, a tyrant who nearly destroyed the Imperium from within because of religious fanaticism. The Moire Schism saw entire Forge worlds turn against Mars over a dispute in religious doctrine. Even the Horus Heresy itself started because some of the Primarchs dared to question the Emperor's methods. And the lost Primarch? He wouldn't just be questioning the Emperor's methods, he would be questioning the very soul of the Imperium. If he were lucky, he would be assassinated before he ever had the chance to spread his message. If he were unlucky, he would find himself at war with half the Imperium, facing not just the High Lords of Terra and the Adeptus Astartes, but entire armies of zealots who would die to defend the lie rather than face the truth. And what makes it even more tragic? He would know he was right. He would know that the Imperium is broken, that it has twisted the Emperor's ideals into something monstrous. He would know that he is fighting for the real vision of the Imperium, the one his father wanted, and he would still lose. Because the Imperium is not designed to be fixed. It is a machine that feeds on its own dysfunction. Every time someone has tried to change it, they have been destroyed, either by the Inquisition, by the ecclesiarchy, or by the sheer inertia of history itself. A lost Primarch would be the most powerful man in the galaxy, and it still wouldn't be enough. And that might be the greatest tragedy of all. Because for all his strength, all his knowledge, all his godlike charisma, he would be facing something that even the Emperor could not defeat. The sheer, unrelenting madness of the Imperium itself. And if he realized that, if he saw that there was no way to fix what had been broken, then there's only one thing he could do: burn it all down. The tragedy of the lost Primarchs is not just that they were erased, it's that they were erased for a reason. Whether it was their own actions, the Emperor's fear, or some secret too terrible to know, their removal from history was not a mistake. It was a deliberate necessity. And if one of them ever returned, he would be faced with a reality he could never have imagined. The Imperium isn't just broken, it is designed to be unbreakable in its dysfunction. It is a machine that runs on its own failure, fueled by an endless cycle of war, sacrifice, and lies. Even Guilliman, one of the most brilliant tacticians in history, has been trapped by it, forced to play by rules he despises just to keep the Imperium from collapsing. A lost Primarch would have no such patience. He would see the Imperium for what it truly is, not the empire his father envisioned, but a grotesque shadow of it. A husk ruled not by wisdom or justice, but by bureaucrats who care more about preserving their own power than about the survival of humanity itself. A theocracy where the emperor is worshipped as a god, his actual ideals long forgotten. A civilization so obsessed with its past that it cannot move forward. Only repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And here's the cruelest part, there would be no right choice for him to make. If he fought to reform the Imperium, he would be crushed under the weight of its inertia. He would be branded a heretic, a traitor, a threat to the very people he was trying to save. Guilliman has already seen how impossible it is to change the Imperium from within, and even he has barely survived the attempt. A second Primarch, unburdened by political caution, would only meet a quicker death. If he fought to destroy the Imperium, he would be damning humanity to a future even worse than the present. For all its horrors, the Imperium is still the only thing keeping humanity from extinction. If it fell, there would be no glorious new order to replace it. Only chaos, darkness, and the waiting jaws of alien and demonic predators. And if he chose to walk away, to vanish into the void, rather than fight a battle he knows he cannot win, then he would become exactly what the Imperium wanted him to be. A ghost, a forgotten legend, a memory that fades until it is nothing at all. There is no victory for a lost Primarch. The Imperium has ensured that his return would only end in tragedy, because the one lesson history has made clear, again and again, is that those who try to change the Imperium, those who try to fix it, are the ones who are erased. And in the end, that may be the only truth that truly matters. Do these theories seem reasonable? Perhaps you have an alternative or even better idea. Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel with notifications turned on so you don't miss my latest uploads.